The snow had been falling since midday, but by nightfall it had become something else entirely. It had become a silence, a white, endless, suffocating silence that pressed down on the Wyoming plains like a hand over a mouth, swallowing every sound, every movement, every trace of the world that existed before winter arrived and decided to stay. Christmas night, 1891, and Elias Carter walked through it alone. His lantern swayed at his side, a small gold flame pushing back just enough darkness to see the next few steps ahead. His boots pressed deep into the snow with every stride, crunch, 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 the only sound for miles in any direction. His breath rose in thick clouds before his face and disappeared into the dark above him. He didn't look up. He never did anymore. There was nothing up there worth looking for. He had walked this same path every single evening for 6 years, out from the cabin door, across the frozen yard, past the old fence post that leaned a little further west every season, and down to the barn. Check the horses, check the fences, make sure nothing else in his life had fallen apart while he wasn't watching. Routine was the only thing that had kept him standing. Not hope, not faith, not the promise of something better waiting around the corner. Just the quiet, reliable mercy of having somewhere to go and something to do when the silence inside the cabin grew too heavy to carry. Elias Carter was 51 years old. He had strong hands, a weathered face, and eyes the pale gray color of winter sky. Eyes that had once held warmth, people said, though there was no one left who remembered that version of him anymore. His nearest neighbor was 4 miles east. The town of Hargrove was 9 miles south, and the last person who had spoken his name with any tenderness had been gone for 6 years, 3 months, and 14 days. He did not count the days on purpose. He simply could not forget them. He was nearly at the barn when he stopped. His boots ceased their crunching. His lantern stilled. He stood in the snow and stared. The barn door was open. Not wide open, just slightly. A thin black line where the wood had been pushed away from the frame. A gap just large enough to let in the cold and let out whatever warmth the animals had managed to gather between them. Elias knew he had closed that door. He always closed that door. He had closed it that very morning and checked the latch twice the way he always did, the way a man does things when habit is the only prayer he has left. His chest tightened slowly, the way it does before something changes. He moved forward. The hinges groaned as he pushed the door wider, the sound splitting the silence like a creak in a church floor. Inside, the cold was different, denser somehow, sharper, as though it had been gathering there for hours. The 2 horses shifted in their stalls, hooves scraping against the frozen earth, ears turning toward him with a nervousness they didn't usually show. They knew him. They were never nervous around him. Elias raised the lantern higher. He scanned the stalls, the beams, the corners deep in shadow. And then he heard it. Faint. So faint he almost dismissed it as the wind working through a crack in the wood. But it came again. A cry. Small and fragile and desperately, unmistakably human. A baby. His heart slammed once, hard against the inside of his ribs. He stood completely still for one long second, the lantern trembling just slightly in his grip, and then his legs were already moving, carrying him toward the ladder at the far end of the barn, before his mind had fully caught up with what was happening. He climbed fast but careful, the old ladder creaking under his weight, the cry above him growing just slightly stronger with each rung. At the top, he swung the lantern out over the loft and froze. There, in the hay, barely visible beneath a thin and useless blanket, lay a young woman. She was curled tightly on her side, her body bent inward like a question mark around the small bundle pressed against her chest. Her hair was dark and tangled, frozen at the edges. Her coat, if it could be called that, was thin cotton, soaked through, the color of old ash. Her boots had holes in them. Her lips, even from where he stood, were the unmistakable pale blue of someone the cold had nearly finished with. And against her chest, barely wrapped, barely moving, the baby. God Almighty, Elias breathed. He was across the loft in 3 steps. He dropped to his knees beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her throat, holding his own breath while he searched for hers. There, a pulse, weak and slow and frightening, but there. The baby let out another cry, thinner this time, as though it was running out of the strength it took to make the sound. "No," Elias said quietly, not to anyone in particular, just to the cold, just to whatever force had brought them here and was now considering taking them back. "No." He pulled his heavy wool coat from his shoulders without hesitation and wrapped it around both of them, tucking it beneath them, around them, over them. Then he gathered the woman into his arms. She was shockingly light, the weight of someone who had been surviving on almost nothing for far too long, and he held the baby carefully against his chest with one arm as he began the slow, deliberate process of getting them both down the ladder and out of that frozen loft. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and fear. Each step, he told himself, steady, steady, steady. Outside, the cold struck him like a wall without his coat, but he barely felt it. He walked fast, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the cabin light ahead, the lantern abandoned in the barn behind him because he needed both arms for what he was carrying. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to coals. He set the woman on the rug near the hearth and held the baby close with one arm while he rebuilt the fire with the other, a task that should have taken 2 hands and several minutes, but somehow took less, because necessity is its own kind of strength. Kindling caught, flames climbed, the room began its slow exhale of warmth. Then he worked, methodically, carefully, with the quiet precision of a man who had once watched a doctor work and had paid close attention because he lived alone and far from town and understood that some days there would be no one else. He replaced their wet clothing with dry cloth. He warmed water to just above lukewarm, not hot, never hot, and used it carefully. He layered blankets. He held the baby against the warmth of his own chest and walked slowly back and forth across the room, back and forth, the floorboards creaking softly beneath him while the fire climbed higher and the night pressed against the windows, and time moved the way it does in moments of crisis, both too fast and too slow to measure. He did not sleep. He did not stop. He simply kept watch, the way he had learned to do, the way a man learns when there is no one else to share the vigil. Near dawn, the baby stirred. A sound rose from her, still small, still fragile, but different now, fuller, more indignant, more alive. Elias closed his eyes briefly, exhaled slowly, and then, behind him, a sharp intake of breath. He turned. The woman's eyes were open, wide and dark and wild with a fear that had nothing to do with the cold, the deeper fear, the animal fear of waking somewhere unfamiliar with your child out of your arms. "My baby!" Her voice was barely a sound, cracked and raw. "She's here," Elias said immediately, turning so she could see. "She's right here. She's warm." The woman stared at her daughter for a long moment. Then the tears came, sudden and silent and complete, rolling down her pale cheeks in the firelight, relief so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. "You were in my barn," Elias said gently, sitting back on his heels to give her space. "Both of you, near frozen." She nodded slowly, swallowing. I couldn't go any further. Her voice was steadier now, though still thin. I saw the light from the barn. I just needed somewhere out of the wind, just for a little while. What's your name? She looked at him for a moment, measuring, cautious, the way a person looks at kindness when they have been disappointed by it before. Claire, she said finally. Claire Dawson, and she's Lily. Elias looked down at the baby in his arms. Lily had fallen back into sleep, one tiny fist curled beneath her chin, her breathing steady and even, and the most reassuring sound he had heard in years. Elias Carter, he said quietly, this is my place. The story came slowly, in pieces, the way hard stories always do, between small sips of broth that Claire held with both hands as though the warmth of the cup was something she needed to believe in, between long pauses where she stared into the fire and gathered herself. She had been traveling west from Missouri with her husband, Thomas, a wagon train, the promise of land, of a new life, of something better than what they were leaving behind. But Thomas had taken sick 3 weeks into the journey, a fever that climbed fast and didn't come back down. By the time the wagon train reached the Wyoming territory, he was gone, and the wagon train, bound by its own brutal arithmetic of survival, could not slow for a widow with an infant and no one to drive her wagon. So they left her. She had walked, through towns that had nothing to offer, through cold that arrived early and stayed. She had spent the last of her money on milk for Lily 2 weeks ago, and had been moving on prayer and stubbornness ever since, following the road west because stopping felt like surrendering. You can stay here, Elias said, when she had finished. His voice was quiet and without decoration. The cabin has a spare room. It's warm. There's food enough. Lily needs to be somewhere safe. He paused. Then, almost to himself, so do you. Claire looked at him for a long time. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and relentless against the glass. Why would you do this? She asked. Her voice was not suspicious anymore. It was something more fragile than that. Something that had almost forgotten how to ask the question at all. Elias was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled between them. Because someone should, he said. That night, after Claire and Lily slept, Elias stood in the narrow hallway of his cabin, his lantern in hand, and looked at the closed door at the end of it. He hadn't opened that door in 6 years. Behind it was a room he had built with his own hands in the 2nd year of his marriage, when his wife Margaret had told him, her voice trembling with joy, that there would be a baby come spring. He had laid every floorboard himself, had sanded the crib smooth by hand, running his palm over the wood again and again until there was not a single rough edge left. Margaret had died in that room. The boy, they had chosen the name Samuel, though he never had the chance to use it, had lived for 4 hours, long enough to be held, not long enough for anything else. Elias had closed that door and had not touched the handle since. But now, standing in the hallway with the sound of a baby's breathing drifting softly from the next room, he found himself standing there longer than he meant to. His hand did not reach for the handle. He did not open it. But he did not walk away either. And somehow that felt like something. The days that followed were quiet and careful, the way trust always is in its early stages, fragile, easily startled, moving slowly on uncertain ground. Claire recovered her strength steadily, color returning to her face, the shadow of exhaustion gradually lifting from around her eyes. She insisted on helping, cooking, cleaning, small repairs she spotted without being asked, And Elias let her, understanding instinctively that dignity matters more than gratitude, that what she needed was not to be taken care of, but to be taken seriously. Lily grew louder and more certain of herself with every passing day, her cries filling the cabin with a particular kind of chaos that Elias had not experienced since a life he no longer let himself think about. She had dark eyes like her mother's and a habit of grabbing whatever finger came near her hand and refusing to let it go. One evening, near the end of the first week, Lily would not stop crying. Claire had been awake most of the previous night and was sitting at the table with her head in her hands, her eyes barely open, apology written all over her face. "Let me," Elias said. Claire looked up uncertainly. He reached down and lifted Lily from the blanket on the floor and held her against his shoulder, one large hand flat against her small back, and began to walk, slow, steady circles around the room. And then, almost without meaning to, he began to hum. Something low and shapeless, not quite a melody, just a sound from somewhere deep, long buried. Gradually, the crying softened, then stopped. Lily turned her head and rested it against his shoulder with the complete and devastating trust that only very small children possess, the trust that has not yet learned to be afraid. When Elias looked up, Claire was watching him from the table. Her eyes were bright with tears she was trying to hold back. "She doesn't do that," Claire said softly. "She doesn't go to people. She never has. Not since—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Not since her father." Elias looked down at the child resting on his shoulder. He felt something move through him then, something vast and quiet and terrifying, like a river shifting beneath ice, something he had spent 6 years making sure he would never feel again, because feeling it meant risking losing it, and he was not certain he could survive another loss of that magnitude. But Lily's small hand had found his collar and was holding on, and he found that he could not bring himself to move. That night, lying in the dark listening to the wind move around the eaves of the cabin, Elias Carter thought about the word home, what it meant, what it required, how it was not the wood and the stone and the roof above a man's head that made a place a home. It was the particular quality of the silence inside it, whether the silence was empty or full, whether it was the silence of a life alone or the silence between people who had decided, without saying so directly, that they were safer together than apart. A storm came 3 days before the new year, 3 days of howling white that erased the horizon and made the world outside the windows disappear entirely. There was nothing to do but stay inside, stay warm, and let the hours pass the way hours do when there is nowhere to be and nothing to prove. They talked, slowly at first, then more easily, about Missouri and Wyoming, about the land and the cold and the particular loneliness of wide-open places. Claire told him about her mother's kitchen in summer, the smell of bread and warm wood. Elias told her about the first horse he had ever owned, a stubborn gray mare named Patience, who had lived up to her name only ironically. Claire laughed at that. It was a simple sound, unguarded, real, and it moved through the cabin like light through a window that had been shut for a very long time. On the last night of the storm, Lily fell asleep in Elias's arms while Claire read by the fire. The wind had softened to a low hum. The flames were steady and warm. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine, and something that Elias realized slowly was the smell of a house where people lived, rather than a house where a man simply survived. "You saved us," Claire said quietly, not looking up from her book. Elias was quiet for a moment, looking around the room, at the fire, at Lily's sleeping face, at the soft light resting on everything. "I think," he said slowly. "It might have gone the other way." Claire looked up. "You gave me something back," he said. "Something I had decided I was done with." He paused. "I was wrong to decide that." Claire held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, not with words, but with the particular understanding of someone who has also decided at some point to be done with hope, and who knows what it costs. Several days later, Elias walked to the end of the hallway. He stood before the closed door. His hand rose slowly and rested on the handle. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the fire to shift in the next room, for Lily to make a small sound in her sleep, for the wind outside to move quietly through the eaves. Then, slowly, he turned the handle, and he opened the door. The room was cold and still and full of the pale winter light that came through the single small window. The crib stood where he had left it, smooth-sanded and patient. The floorboards held their silence. Everything was exactly as he had left it, but somehow it was different now, smaller, less like a wound and more like a room that could perhaps be something again. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he walked inside. That winter in Wyoming did not make headlines. It did not end wars or change the course of history. It was simply a winter, cold and long and indifferent the way nature always is. But inside one small cabin, 9 miles north of Hargrove, something happened that the cold could not account for and the silence could not contain. 3 people found each other in the dark, and the darkness, for the first time in a very long while, did not win. Because that is the thing about genuine human kindness, the kind that asks nothing, that gives without calculating, that opens a door at midnight in a frozen barn without stopping to consider the cost. It does not announce itself. It does not wait for gratitude. It simply acts because someone must, because the alternative is a world where a woman and her baby freeze to death on Christmas night, and nobody ever knows. Elias Carter had thought his life was finished, that the best of it had come and gone, and what remained was simply the long, quiet work of enduring. He had made his peace with that, or so he believed. But peace and surrender are not the same thing. And sometimes the most extraordinary gift the universe can offer a broken man is not comfort or certainty or the return of what was lost. It is simply a reason to open the door. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that kindness costs nothing and changes everything, please take a moment to subscribe to Desert Hearth. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the longest winter eventually makes way for something warm. And leave a comment below. We read every single one, and your words mean more than you know. This is Desert Hearth, where the fire is always on, and you are always welcome here. The story carries several layers of meaning that extend beyond entertainment. It portrays the reality of westward migration in 1891, the genuine dangers faced by women traveling alone, the harsh mortality of childbirth on the frontier, and the isolation of rural American life in the 19th century. It speaks honestly about grief and how prolonged loss can cause a person to withdraw from the very things that give life meaning. It demonstrates that community and human connection are not luxuries but necessities, that isolation, however chosen, is a kind of slow disappearance. Most profoundly, it models a form of masculinity rooted not in dominance but in quiet service, a man who acts not for recognition, but because the moment demands it. For older American audiences, this story affirms that it is never too late to heal, never too late to open a door that has been closed, and never too late to allow life back in.